China's president promises a safe and splendid Winter Games, but the pandemic and politics are hanging heavy. Observers say the Winter Games have only reaffirmed China's position as a global power, even if a US-led diplomatic boycott somewhat mars the proceedings. Olivia Xiong with this report.
A striking mega structure built in the lead-up to the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing. The National Stadium, or Bird's Nest, was not only the venue for an extravagant opening ceremony watched by 1 billion at home and abroad, but an emblem of China's newfound place in the world.
There were a few nights that I passed by the Niao Cao, the Bird's Nest Stadium, and it was still filled with onlookers just looking at this marvelous architecture. And I think there was just so much pride among the Chinese that they are finally here announcing themselves to everyone else that, hey, China is a global power.
As a foreign journalist covering the historic games, Mr. Pei recalls the 2008 Olympics was described as China's coming out party, its confidence growing even more so after the mega event, as the country emerged relatively unscathed from the global financial crisis that followed.
I was reporting in an atmosphere in the midst of an increasingly assertive China, increasingly confident China. The phrase that a scholar shared with me when I was reporting there was that China was like a steroid superpower. So that definitely had a big impact on how China would deal with things like media freedom and access to information.
That confidence has become even more prominent as Beijing gets ready to host the Olympics again, 14 years on. After all, the country has lifted millions out of poverty, modernized its military, and taken on a more strident foreign policy, positioning itself as a leader on the world stage.
Now, as Beijing gets itself ready to play host for the Winter Olympics, observers tell me that it seems clear that the world, and especially the US, recognize that the China of today is no longer the China of 2008, with the Biden administration labeling the country a key rival. This time, the US is leading a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Games, citing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, a contrast to 2008, when then-American President George Bush himself led a delegation to the Summer Olympics.
This in spite of criticism over China's human rights record then, with violent protests erupting in Tibet just months before the Summer Games and then quickly squashed.
Several international NGOs and activists raised concern over this issue just until before the Summer Olympic Games. But at that time, the maintenance of the economic relationship with China was far more important foreign policy agenda for the many Western nations than tackling human rights issues. But this time, the controlling Chinese rising power is more important.
But the external pressure will likely do little to make Beijing budge, something the 2008 Games also showed. Though at that time, restrictions on foreign journalists were eased for a while, limited broadcasts at the sensitive Tiananmen Square allowed, and so-called protest zones set up.
2008 showed that China could still do what it wanted in many ways. You know, it did work to minimize or reduce some air pollution. But on the other side of things, you know, the freedom of the press, China didn't really relax anything or very little. And so they gave them the opportunity to realize we can hold firm in what we want to do and not bend to these external organizations.
The COVID-19 pandemic may have also mitigated some potential flare-ups this time, with no overseas spectators allowed at the Games and public ticket sales to locals cancelled. But still, China is not taking any chances at its big moment again. Reports say local activists have had their social media restricted. China has also warned athletes that any behavior that violates the Olympic spirit or Chinese rules could spell punishment. Olivia Xiong, CNA, Beijing.